Asset managers, and more specifically their marketing and wholesaling teams, have never needed data more than they do today to meet their distribution goals. Whether they are trying to diversify their investor base, penetrate desirable new channels like RIAs or family offices, or simply keep pace in the distributed digital marketplace, asset managers need actionable data now more than ever. Forward-looking asset managers have been on this path for the past 10 years, but the COVID-19 pandemic has made this imperative acute for everyone in this space. It is digital or die these days, and data is the lifeblood of that strategy. My name is Salim Khan. I'm the Chief Data and Analytics Officer here at Discovery Data, and today we'll be discussing some approaches asset managers, wholesalers, and their marketing teams can take in a post-pandemic world to engage with advisors. To set the stage for our discussion, I wanted to throw out a few data points for your consideration. Number one, the retail RIA space has grown tremendously over the past 10 years. In 2009, retail RIA firms had $2.5 trillion in assets under management. In 2020, we calculated almost $15 trillion in AUM, a 6x increase over the past 10 years. We also see record deal flow. So last year, there were almost 205 deals, a record for the industry in terms of firm acquisitions, as data collected from Echelon Partners shows. And lastly, there was a recent report by Broadridge that showed that, essentially they were espousing that there's a need for asset managers and wholesalers to hyper-focus their efforts on email marketing campaigns, creating websites specific for advisors, as well as engaging social media more. Now, our discussion today will focus on three key areas: data, personalization, and behavioral intent. The data component is really about the data that you need to be able to reach the audiences that you want to reach as an asset manager or wholesaler. The personalization component is really about, once you've gathered the email information, the phone numbers, and contact data for these individuals, how do you break through the noise with a personalized outreach and personalized message? And finally, we'll be talking about behavioral intent data. Behavioral intent is a new frontier for us. It's data that can help predict what an advisor might be doing in the near future. So it's fascinating data and a fascinating new frontier for us. To discuss these trends and describe some tangible steps asset managers can take post-pandemic, I have STACY Havener joining me. STACY is the founder and CEO of Havener Capital Partners, a sales and marketing agency that helps boutique asset managers build, launch, and grow funds. Havener Capital is on a mission to level the playing field in asset management by raising $100 billion for boutiques over the next decade. STACY, thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me, Salim. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, I think we could jump right into it. So
do it.
We'll start off with the data question. So yeah. I guess the first question I have for you is, what is it that the best of the breed are doing from a marketing data standpoint? Why is accurate data so important to top tier asset managers and wholesalers?
Well, it's a great question. I mean, I should probably ask you about the data, as opposed to you asking me. But we were saying in the sort of green room earlier, back in the day, if you were, using data, let's say you were taking a trip to Atlanta, and if you were using data, you'd be like, oh my gosh, watch my moves. I am going to triangulate on Atlanta and find all the advisors who are within driving distance of the metro area. And you'd be like, yes, I'm crushing it with data. Okay, we've evolved a little from then. Still valid, but the power of data, most of us are only scratching the surface, really. I think what has happened, other industries have for sure paved the way. Technology and asset management, we're probably not as users of technology. Asset managers are probably not leading edge or cutting edge on technology. But by partnering with someone like Discovery, you can sort of balance your unique ability with their unique ability. So I think what we're seeing asset managers do now has gone far beyond triangulation on travel or territory or geography. It's really looking at things like target market, which I would love to talk about. It's even looking at things beyond like AUM and size of account. You're looking at the ability to use data in much more intelligent ways beyond numbers.
Right. So it sounds like data has essentially become table stakes. And when we say data, we're talking about the basic email, phone numbers, contact information. And so I guess at that point, you have to make an argument, well, if data has become table stakes, how does a sales and marketing team now employ that data in order to get the best outcome for their enterprises? Are they using CRM systems? What are they doing? So what do you see?
So let me talk a little bit about target market. And to your point, we focus, our client base is the boutique asset manager who we define as sort of under 10 billion. And so what a boutique asset manager is going to be able to do with data is probably different than what like BlackRock is going to be able to do with data, right? They're just from size of team and budget and all those reasons. And I want to be sure that the boutiques that are listening understand that this is it's not out of your reach. Okay. You have to still use data. And again, what you do with that data is going to be different than what BlackRock is going to do with that data, but it doesn't mean it's any less valuable. So let me give you an example of how we use data for boutiques that we work with. So a lot of the clients that come to us, again, they're boutique asset managers, and our sweet spot is in new funds. So if you think about this, you're launching a new fund. This is like not easy to do. Okay. This is probably like the most difficult part of the capital raising spectrum right here. So you have this day one fund and you're trying to figure out how am I going to find investors for this thing? It probably has, not too much money in it, doesn't have a lot of track record. Okay. So I have a great example. So target market for us is sort of saying, okay, well, who's the ideal investor for this fund? Now, we have some proprietary data that we have in our CRM of who are early adopters. But we want to take that one step further because even early adopters, it's a big group. So we have a client and their pedigree is that the founder of this boutique was the global chief investment strategist at Merrill Lynch for like 20 years. Okay. To the point that people stopped this man on the street and asked for his autograph. Okay. Like it was a really big job and he had a really big following. Now, we all know what has happened with some of these wirehouses, right? There's been a ton of bifurcation and breakaways. So when we started working with this client, we said, okay, you know what? Discovery is so key for this. We need to triangulate on the advisors who have ties back to Merrill because they may know this founder. So that was pass number one. And this is a good lesson too with data. It's very iterative. The more you learn, the more powerful the data can become. So first pass, okay, let's target all the firms that have ties back to Merrill. Great. Sales team reaches out. They're like, it's not really working. And I'm like, well, that's garbage. So let's go back to the drawing board. Here's what we figured out. Not only did it have to be someone with ties to Merrill, but we had to reach the person who worked at Merrill when this gentleman was the global chief investment strategist, who, by the way, that person wasn't the 25-year-old analyst. It was typically the founder of the firm. So we had to do some stuff with age, right? How old is this person that has the ties back to Merrill? So I use that as an example of even when you're starting out, even if you don't have salespeople yet, or you just have one salesperson, data can be incredibly powerful to develop this target market, to find your early adopter investors, and to market to them, both sales and marketing. Like target market is going to be key here. So I hope that's a good example of just how you can use data.
Yeah, it sounds like it's, if you're a boutique firm, you cast that net to be pretty wide. And you make no presuppositions about the segments or the audiences you're going to go after, right? To your example on Merrill, for instance, it's about widening the aperture and just making sure that you're using the data and the statistics to kind of drive which segments you're going to go after.
I think that's right, because you don't want the aperture too wide. In other words, you don't want to go into discovery and say, oh, there's 17,000 RIAs. I have a 17,000 RIA target market now. That's not going to work. You really want to triangulate with some specificity. And that's, so first you have to do the work on what is that specificity? What is that niche? And then how do I triangulate down? In some ways, actually, narrower is better, right? Because if you got really specific, I think you'd see a higher conversion rate in that target market than if you kept, to use your language, the aperture very, very wide.
Right. Okay, now we've got the data that we need, the segments that we need.
Yep.
We know who we're going after.
Yep.
I guess now in a post-pandemic world, one of the biggest problems we have is that we don't have a lot of personal interactions with individuals. And so that initial outreach becomes difficult, right?
Yeah.
And so I would assume that in order to have good initial outreach, there should be some personalized touch in your messaging, meaning, can you have some sort of icebreakers, or, did you happen to attend the same school as the advisor that you're targeting? What have you seen firms do in terms of breaking through the noise? There's a lot of emails. We're getting a lot of emails during the pandemic. How do you break through the noise when everyone's being marketed to via email? Are there any steps that you've seen or techniques?
It's a great question, great topic, super important topic. And I also feel like you were kind of in our sales call, like a fly on the wall today, because we were talking about this exact issue. So what doesn't work, especially if you're a boutique, is to send emails that could be sent to anyone. If it could be sent to anyone, it should be sent to no one, right? So if I send you a template email, Salim, and it just has a fact sheet attachment, and I say, here's the fact sheet, let me know if you need anything, that is like the worst email you could possibly send, okay? Like maybe only second to checking in, which is my very least favorite email you could ever possibly send. So on our sales call today, I was saying, we have a mantra. This is going to be our mantra for when you're reaching out to someone. And it ties exactly back to your personalization. Show them you know them. Show them you know them. If you do that, the person that receives the email receives it much differently. Right? And that email cannot be sent to anyone else, because if you do a good job of showing them you know them, it's going to be very specific to them.
Right.
And so I think you're spot on with that. Data, you guys have great data that you can use to triangulate on some of this stuff. And I think laying, kind of like an overlay to that would be spending time on social media. We were chatting about social media earlier, but go and don't just, use the data and then say, I've got the data, I'm going to go and do. Use the data and then continue your research on the intel. Go to social media and see what these people are writing about. Go to the website and look at the blog, and then overlay that with the data you've been able to glean from discovery. And now you've all of a sudden got a much richer tapestry than just like, hey, I see you like golf. I do too. Should we chat? I think there's a way to have it be more normal, if you will. Again, we say here, people invest with people. So be a person.
Right. Yeah, just following on to that point, I recently saw a report from Forrester Consulting that said that if a brand communicates in a more human, quote unquote, way, customers are 1.6 times more likely to make a purchase and 1.8 times more likely to recommend that particular brand. There is a certain, kind of creepiness aspect to personalization, right? Because you know something about someone else. But can you speak to shifting consumer attitudes when it comes to personalization? I've also seen stats that say that millennials tend to favor more personalization and more targeting. But what are your thoughts on some of the shifts there in terms of that?
It's great. I think, there's a creepy factor. There's also a little bit of a robotic factor that sometimes weaves its way into these emails where you're like, you have a template and I see that you've just inserted my school. And it's very clear to me that this is a template. So that's the challenge, right? Is again, if you put yourself in the shoes of the person you're sending the email to, how would you feel if you got the email? Mm-hmm. Like, don't throw up every single, paragraph and stat that you could possibly say about your firm. Don't throw that all up in the first email. No one's going to read it. Again, like that vibe that you said of, be human, be a person, and then think about how that's received. So, I mean, if someone sent me an email and they started talking about soccer and they played college soccer, or their daughter plays soccer and they've read my blogs and they've just really been inspired, I mean, there's no other way for me to feel than honored and grateful and flattered. And so it is probably going to make me more apt to read the rest of the email.
Right.
So
that's great.
It's a balance, right? But if you put yourself in the shoes of the person receiving the email, that usually will help you write the email in a better way. Less creepy, less robotic.
That's right. That's our goal. Let's try to be less creepy and less robotic. Anyway, Stacey, it has been an absolute pleasure speaking with you.
Thank you.
I really enjoyed the conversation here. And we look forward to future conversations with you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Salim. And thanks for all you do in the industry.
So just to discuss our last topic around behavioral intent, I have DUNCAN MACDONALD-KORTH joining us. DUNCAN is the founder and CEO of AdvisorTarget. DUNCAN is an end-to-end data expert specializing in how to generate, organize, and create value out of data that can be monetized to the benefit of all parties. DUNCAN previously worked in equity research at Morgan Stanley and fixed income sales trading at Merrill Lynch. He did his undergraduate work at the University of Oregon and his postdoctorate work at the University of Oxford. He brings his unusual fusion of financial services knowledge and doctoral training in anthropology to create innovative solutions for the industry. Welcome, Duncan. Thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you, Salim. I appreciate the nice intro, and I don't think it's ironic that an anthropologist is going to be talking about behavioral intent data.
That sounds about right. It is about the study of people, right? So it makes perfect sense. So let's dive right into it, Duncan. I guess the first question I have for you is, explain for our audience what exactly is intent data, behavioral intent data, and what is it within the context of the asset management world?
So absolutely. So intent data is a loaded term, and frankly, it can be a very broad one depending on where you're using it. But specifically in the context of asset management, what we mean by intent data is behavioral information on intermediaries, such as financial advisors, that can be used to predict transaction behavior.
So Duncan, to build on that idea, so it sounds like behavioral intent data is a way of determining what next best action someone might take. Is that a fair way of assessing what marketing intent data is?
Absolutely. The question is, how do you go about deriving that intent is the magic of it.
Right. So speaking of that, of the magic of where this data comes from, can you explain a little bit about how this data is collected? What are the mechanisms used to collect this information? And then once you do collect the information, how do you go about actually determining intent? Is there an algorithm? Is there machine learning? How is that piece done?
Yeah, absolutely. So the way that we're deriving intent is to take behavioral information off of a number of financial news sites, in particular news sites that are frequented by financial advisors. And what we have is a patented non-cookie based tracking technology that allows us to identify financial advisors down to their CRD, and then essentially let them show us what they're interested in by what they're choosing to read on an editorial basis. Again, it's not a marketing response. It's what they're actually just choosing to read in their normal flow of research and business. And then to answer your second question, so then from there, we aggregate all that information and we structure it according to the categories that they read. So think, fixed income mutual funds, and then the specific keywords associated with that. So maybe they read about, high yield bonds and credit. And then what we do is we take all this engagement and we're looking at 10 different, say, behavioral data points. So, how long were they on site? What was the priority in which they clicked? Did they read articles that were closely related to each other, et cetera, et cetera? And we use data science and a specialized algorithm to determine the advisors that looked most likely to transact, whether that be buy or sell. And then we pass that information on to clients.
Got it. So that the data is collected through various mechanisms, including online sources and other sources, and then synthesized algorithmically into an actual signal. So you have a signal that an individual may have intent to buy muni bonds or may have intent to buy an ESG related product. So that all makes sense. Now, I guess the next question is, how can this data be used to effectively find those segments that have exhibited the buying intent? So now let's say, we put ourselves in the shoes of a boutique asset manager that, originates assets that are ESG based. How would they use this marketing intent data to reach out to advisors?
Absolutely. So there's a number of ways that it can be used. And frankly, some of it also depends on the scale of the organization. So as you said, a boutique asset manager specializing in ESG would have potentially a different application or use case than, say, a top 5 asset manager with over $1 trillion in assets. So at its core, most of this data is about sales. So how can we grow assets within our target advisor universe? So primarily what would be used for a boutique is, I would say, maybe 2 different levels. So one, the signals themselves. And by signals, essentially, we mean information on specific CRDs that match that boutique asset manager's target universe of advisors. So those that they have selling agreements with, the platform availability, et cetera. And we would pass along information that would include CRD information, any contact info, and then the specific engagement points as it relates to ESG. So maybe it's ESG and SRI or carbon capture, et cetera. And then the boutique they'd have their sales team reach out to those specific advisors and have productive conversations, again, contextualized by the information they've received for us about what those advisors are interested in. Then hopefully that would lead to sales. So that's one use case. And then additionally, boutique asset managers can use our trending data, so the general trending topics that are resonating with advisors, say from month to month, week to week, quarter to quarter, to help influence the way that they position their firm, both in the terms of conversations, but also in terms of marketing, white papers, podcasts, webinars, et cetera.
So Duncan, thank you very much for explaining the boutique asset manager use case. I guess the next question would be, how do top tier asset management firms use this marketing intent data?
Yeah, thank you for that. So we've found that the use case can be quite different between the two because the resources involved in how the intent data can be employed are quite differential between sizes of firms. And so we tailor the offering accordingly. So with a large asset manager, the integration tends to be more comprehensive. So it's not just about signals and who's interested at what moment. It's more about getting large amounts or continuous flows of behavioral information on an entire CRD universe, and then being able to use that in multiple ways. So there are 3 pillars really to the use of intent data at scale, and those would be for distribution, for marketing, and for data science. In distribution, they're largely kind of what I talked about earlier, which is helping to guide outreach. So who's interested in what at what moment, and how can we have a productive conversation? But equally so, large asset managers can better employ sentiment data in the sense that they can give us a list of, hey, these are all the CRDs. Here's 100,000 CRDs we care about. And can you stream us all the engagement information for those CRDs? Okay, we do that. And what they'll do is they'll say, okay, this CRD, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, she's a great client. And she owns $1 million of our large cap growth fund. But we see that she's been reading some very bearish stories about large cap growth. And in that case, they can use that information for their relationship manager, their wholesaler, to reach out to that great client, talk about them, take their temperature, and hopefully avoid a big redemption. So it's not just about bringing in new assets, it's about protecting assets. On the marketing front, it's quite similar as well. So it's about guiding not only the internal content production efforts, which I talked about before, but also all large managers are spending 6-7 figures on advertising, and they need to understand amongst their target CRD group what topics are resonating. So if you can understand in our target universe, these are the topics that are most important, then you know exactly the keywords to buy on social media, and you know what kind of copy to produce for your advertising, as well as your internal efforts. So that's that one. And then on the data science front, I must say our clients are absolute best innovators, and the use cases grow every day. I'll just give a quick sample of 3. Tied to the marketing side, one thing that's quite common is for asset managers to use our data as a source of truth to reconcile against click data they're getting from their disparate advertising campaigns all over the internet. So what they do is they'll get a click from an ad that ran somewhere, say about muni bonds, but a lot of times the wholesaler won't want to call that individual because they don't really know how good of a lead it is. So what asset managers do is they use the information from that click, they bounce it against our intent data, they say, okay, has this person been interested editorially in this topic? Have they or have they not? Oh, they have. Okay, that means it's probably a good lead, and then they kick it onto the wholesaler. So that's one. The second is pretty much every large client of ours matches our data to their data packs and the asset data that they have to figure out and try to predict what behavior will lead to a transaction, and in doing so, improve their sort of lead scoring algorithms. And finally, this is an interesting one. A lot of our clients try to use our information not just for sort of granular phone calls with an individual advisor, but for planning their overall distribution strategy. And one of the ways they do that is they'll take our individual CRD level data and they'll roll it up to a firm CRD. So they'll say, okay, let's look at 5,000 Merrill Lynch advisors in aggregate and figure out the 4 or 5 most important things for them based on what they've been reading about. And they'll use that to guide their overall products that they're trying to pitch to that firm. And so they have this macro plan of attack, but then also when they actually make the phone call, they obviously have the granular CRD level information to contextualize that conversation. So those are just a few of the use cases for larger asset managers.
Okay, great. That's great. So I guess, one other question that comes to mind is, what does the roadmap look like for employing this intent data? I would assume that, you would have to early on have really good, accurate contact information from an asset management standpoint, contact information on advisors. That would be the bedrock that you would build on. Then maybe some personalized information on those contacts. And then I would assume that, the intent data lives atop that contact information, because without that contact information and knowing who the individual is, the intent data itself is not as useful. All you're getting is really just trending information from a macro perspective. So can you describe to me what a typical roadmap looks like for employing intent data that you've seen with your customers?
Yeah, I think that there are 4 steps to a productive use of intent data. And the first 2 you exactly got right. So the first is you have to know who's who, right? And the kind of data, so CRD level biographical information allows you to segment your target audience. Then once you have that and you've identified your target audience, you need to be able to personalize your outreach based on, say, the interests and the demographics of that group. So that's step 2. And then step 3 is really where the rubber meets the road as it concerns intent data, which is how do we time our outreach and customize the conversation that we're going to have and the context for how we're reaching out to that client based on what they've shown interest in recently. And that's very critical for the inclusion of intent. But then there's a step 4 too, which is how do we keep that knowledge of engagement and of interest alive beyond that initial conversation that we have. So having the ability to sort of log behavioral information and keep a profile on that CRD up to date over time so we can have some context as we reach out in the future.
That's fantastic. I did not realize there were so many different ways in which, asset managers, large asset managers, as well as probably boutique, can benefit from this intent data. Everything from the relationship building component that you mentioned to the data science, the distribution use case. Seems like there's a myriad of different use cases here. Now, one last question I have, I'd be remiss not to ask this as a chief data and analytics officer here. But can you speak a little bit about the data science piece here and how you went about, developing the product from a data science standpoint, and then how do you engage with data scientists on the asset management side? I would assume those are your biggest customers.
Yes. So the data science side, I'll admit at the beginning, was a lot of trial and error, which is as it should be. There are a couple components to bring up in terms of the inputs to the data science, if you will. So the pieces of information that then we're balancing against one another. And so I'd say there's two things really to speak about. One is a lot of the magic here is in the actual keywords associated with articles. And so we do all of that across the whole network manually. And the reason why is the art of deriving intent from editorial reading behavior is about accurately marrying subject lines and keywords with how a human being would actually understand the tone and point of an article. And so you have to do that correctly. And we actually started off doing that programmatically by just sucking out keywords. And what happened is you get a lot of false positives. So imagine a story about US interest rate policy that maybe just in the context of talking about global growth mentions China. If you were to programmatically pull out keywords, your system would think that article is intent about China when really it had nothing to do with it. And so the tagging is very important. And then on the measurement side, so obviously we're trying to constantly improve our data science. And one thing that's very valuable is information, transactional and asset data we get from independent broker-dealers, which has individual CRD level information in it, which allows us to say, okay, well, we predicted this would happen. Did it happen or did it not? And then we can sharpen our scoring. So those are really important pillars to what we do.
Well, that's great. So it's a clear roadmap there from soup to nuts to be able to employ this marketing intent data and truly get the real ROI and the real benefit. And, our companies have worked together on a couple of initiatives. And, we've seen customers that have, generated 20, 30x ROI on their investment. I mean, would you say that is, the average return, customers are seeing? Is that the usual expected output here?
Well, I'll be a little bit shy because it seems too good to be true, but I can say that the effectiveness of the product has been exceptional. And right. Not just so there's different ways to measure it, of course. There's the actual asset growth, which is what everyone cares about. But it's not just about immediate asset growth. It's also about relationship management, having productive phone calls. Right. So we've also been extremely effective in not only marketing engagement, so how well clients are engaging with marketing outreach, which is a bigger scale than what you can do on the phone, but also in the productivity rate of phone calls. So the rate in which wholesalers are finding the conversations with our signals highly productive versus what they would get on average. And that leads to immediate sales, but also long-term better relationships.
Okay, great. Well, this has been absolutely fascinating. I think behavioral intent and marketing intent is kind of a new frontier for the asset management world. I don't think it's something that has really been around for a very long time. And it's something that is really on the bleeding edge of what we're trying to do in asset management and specifically within marketing. So I really appreciate your time, Duncan, and I appreciate you giving us a little bit of your thoughts on this subject. Just to kind of wrap up our discussion here, we talked about 3 distinct topics here. We talked about data, personalization, and marketing intent, and how all of these components taken together really provide you that ability as an asset manager and wholesaler to get to the next level of being able to not only reach out to the right audiences and the right segments, but to engage with them in a more personalized way, but then also engage with them at the right time. That's where the marketing intent and behavioral intent piece comes in. So just to summarize, we went through those 3 points, and we really, really appreciate your time and staying focused on this conversation here with us. Thank you.
Thank you.